So thank you, Branka, for talking to me today and to the students at the University of Waterloo. We're going to be talking about the impact of technology on modern warfare. We're going to explore a number of questions, and so I thought the place for us to start was really with an overview of the impact of technology on modern warfare. If you could basically identify the main areas of impact and say a little bit about those. And then as we proceed through the interview, we'll look into a number of these areas.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say, particularly when it comes to the use of, for example, of artificial intelligence tools, support tools across the military domain, it's really been, it's being used in all applications from sensors to actual platforms to shaping decision making to hiring and back-end processes, for militaries. And then, of course, in the information space and shaping the information space. So, to just practically break it down for you, what does that mean? So, for example, on the ground in places like Ukraine, what we've seen is the testing of AI tools such as object recognition tools to improve, military maneuvers and movements in the battle space to guide different platforms or to guide different weapons to potential targets. And indeed, there's this concept of the last mile in sort of targeting, where once the drone has locked onto a target, what we are seeing is then the drone can, because of its, has this sort of ability to recognize the target, then locks on and completes the execution or the targeting itself. So that shows a greater development of autonomy in some of these systems. For the most part, the systems we're still seeing are quite, early days in terms of the types of and extent of autonomy that they have. But it's certainly been, I think, a leapfrogging because of this particular conflict in terms of the types of platforms and systems we're seeing being adapted and altered. Oftentimes, when we would talk about autonomous weapons, people would imagine really sophisticated bipedal robots, science fiction and film-like structures, but that's not at all what sort of the concern was. The concern has always been that existing platforms would be modified and would be able to carry certain actions and what we call the critical functions, which are the selection and engagement of targets in weapon systems without a sufficient degree of human control or oversight. The second development I sort of mentioned has been the shaping of decision making. And we see this in places like Gaza, where AI decision support tools were used to identify targets, to recommend targets. And that number went from something like the Israeli Defense Forces had something like, 100 targets a year in Gaza, and then they will go from 100 targets a year to 100 targets a day. And obviously the speed and scale of that targeting is another sort of key profound shift that this technology is allowing. And then what we're seeing also is the shaping of decision making by sort of key army personnel who are using some of these tools, including tools that are quite familiar to all of us right now. Large language models, obviously closed large language models, but nonetheless are using some of these tools to influence their decision making. So now, initially I started paying attention to these topics in 2015 and attending the UN meetings, more now 11 years ago. And we were very, very concerned about the concept of human control. And human control undoubtedly is still a key concern because human control directly ties back to human accountability and the fact that someone has to be accountable for decisions, such as targeting. However, what we're seeing with the shaping of decision making is also the fact that we need to talk about human agency. So if your whole worldview and if the decisions that you're making, even if you're sort of perceived as being in control, are shaped by these technological outputs, to what extent are you exercising agency. So that has become, I think, a really important and thoughtful area of research and study in this area. And then thirdly, of course, the shaping of the information environment. Militaries generally want to focus on shaping the information environment in the places where they're deployed or they're engaged or even pre-engagement. So the use of some of these tools to influence operations, to influence individuals in various places, of course, offer another scale in speeding up in terms of how we think about warfare. And now we're also talking about cognitive warfare, right? The use of some of these tools to really shape mindsets of individuals in various societies. And the shaping of the information environment is very critical because with the use of, for example, deep fakes, what has happened and sort of this at the same time we've seen the sort of level of distrust grow because of these tools and technologies. What we see is even if the technology is not used, even if the image has not been altered in some way or doctored in some way, the fact that it can be doctored in such a way or shaped in such a way, or that it could potentially be a deep fake, has meant that even images that are real are being questioned for their veracity. So again, some of these tools can be used by militaries, but they're also, functioning in this environment where the ability to share propaganda and misinformation and disinformation has also scaled. So this is a really interesting time for us to see how these transformations are truly shaping how we think about warfare and how it's fought in both in the battle spaces, in the decision-making spaces, and then also in terms of the information environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating time, even with my limited knowledge. I'm aware that in Ukraine, particularly, the nature of the war or the way the war has been conducted has changed just over these last few years. In a relatively short space of time, there's been a radical change in the way that that war has been fought. I thought we'd go into some of the areas that you've mentioned. The next area I wanted to look at was the question of cybersecurity. So you didn't talk about that specifically in your introduction, but I thought it might be valuable for us to touch on it. So with cybersecurity, how important is that, and what are the main elements of it, I guess, today?
Absolutely. So cyber security ultimately sort of is at the core of a lot of this technological development because any connected digitized space is vulnerable to attack. And the greater the distance between the operators and the actual battle spaces, the weaker sort of the protections of the direct link between the human and the platform, the greater the potential for jamming and spamming and spoofing, the greater the potential for malware, for these different algorithms to also be attacked, right? So the sort of way we think about cybersecurity, I think, has been sort of as like a specific field or area that protects information and platforms, and we kind of assume that it's there. The challenge in this space is because we've seen such a speed of transformation of technology, like you mentioned. Sometimes the focus is on getting the technology into the battle spaces or getting the technology into the hands of those who need it without necessarily considering the vulnerabilities that technology might have. So this is why cyber plays such an important role. I think one of the early sort of days of the war in Ukraine, the assumption was, or even before it started, the assumption was that the Russians, would use sort of their cyber might to really undermine Ukrainian protections. We didn't see that happen to the extent that there were, of course, a number of cyber attacks that were sort of critical, looking at attacking satellites, information data centers, and different information systems. But we didn't see it at such a scale. And then this whole question emerged of how important is cyber actually? Or like, does cyber might actually translate into actual military power? And I think that might be the wrong question to ask. What I think we need to understand is how can cyber be used or misused and for what purposes, and also what are the limitations. One of the things that we don't talk about enough with some of this technology is that it does have its limitations. Even if we witness the technological transformations, that doesn't mean that you don't need mass. Mass in military terms purely means like people, boots on the ground, people to fight the wars. You still need mass. You're still going to need tanks. You're still going to need people who are going to take control over that territory and hold that territory. But what the technological transformations are doing, such as cyber, is they're providing us with new vulnerabilities in defenses of different countries. And also, once you digitize this sort of whole chain and this technology is further integrated into existing platforms and systems, you have, you have to really think about how do you protect those systems against malicious attack. And of course, your adversaries have, an incredible incentive to try and undermine your various systems, particularly if you're more technologically advanced military. The sort of more adversarial states or groups will try to undermine that technological link. And cyber plays a big role in how you undermine some of these systems. And we've seen, for example, with the recent U.S. actions in Venezuela, what we saw is, or if he is to be believed, but, the U.S. President Donald Trump said, we launched a cyber attack on their, their power grid, and the electricity went out. And that's the sort of attacks that we might expect to see. We're increasingly seeing what are called gray zone tactics or warfare tactics. So these are activities which fall under the threshold of sort of what would be considered an act of war, but still undermine security. And so when we think about sort of our dichotomy of like wartime, peacetime, that sort of is blurring. And these cyber tools and technologies allow for that blurring of peace and wartime, because state actors sometimes sponsor different groups to attack infrastructure, particularly, sort of critical infrastructure. But other times, militaries might be more directly involved in that sort of space themselves. And so I have given you a lot, but I think what's happening is what we're seeing is that cyber is so key and so central to how modern wars are fought. And even if you are not in a time of war, you are still vulnerable. And there's still, if there's an adversarial state with particular incentive, interest, or reason, you still have to really think about the implications on your national security.
Yeah, your response really raises lots of questions that militaries, I guess, have to deal with today around the proportionality of their response, around the extent to which they devote resources to cyber versus conventional forms of warfare or technology in other areas. And, I think it seems you've outlined that very well, that these are these important questions. You talked in your introduction about autonomous weapons systems. And, this is an area that I think is probably very important. I'm interested in the extent to which we should be concerned about it, which seems high, but also about whether you think the impact of them can be controlled in an effective way. I'm aware that, some nations have tried to coordinate a response here, but there seem to be struggling, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the challenge that autonomous weapon systems pose is precisely because we don't have clarity around the sort of the development and use of some of this technology. I think you rightly are pointing to the fact that it's going to be actually difficult to know if a system is functioning in a mode that is, going beyond the agreed limits on autonomy. I mentioned that last mile solution. We're getting to that level of autonomy. We're inching closer to it where it is becoming problematic. So it might be understandable or acceptable in the case of Ukraine defending itself, against an invasion to use some of these tools and technologies. But would we be okay with that kind of system being used maybe at a border or something? And that's where we're getting into this discussion that has been happening for the past, 11, 12 years now at the United Nations. At the United Nations Convention, certain conventional weapons in Geneva. And attending those meetings, what became really clear is that most states, the vast majority of states, agreed that international humanitarian law, existing international humanitarian law applies, and states and militaries are still bound by ensuring that their military responses are proportional, that there is accountability. But what also became clear is that it was not sufficient, that existing international law was not sufficient, which is not surprising. So whether we talk about cyber or whether we talk about autonomous weapons or new technologies, our international laws just were not built for a world where these technologies were available. So the Geneva Conventions, provide the core that we need and are still relevant, but they're insufficient to address the types of questions that emerge when you use systems that have a degree of autonomy. So, for example, what emerges is this question of, if you're not fully exercising human agency, or you're not truly exercising a significant enough degree of human control, can you actually be held accountable? Can you be held accountable if, the system is a black box and you weren't properly trained on it and you don't understand what it's doing? Or if the system optimizes a decision that you did not approve initially? And so those are, I think sometimes in the room, it may seem like the discussion and understanding of the issues is not sophisticated because the states are kind of repeating similar lines, and they fall into different camps. So there is definitely that we should ban and prohibit autonomous weapon systems which function without a degree of human control and human or involvement. And that's something like 30 something states that have been pretty consistent in sort of saying, no, we need to prohibit these systems. And then there's sort of a more oppositional group made up of major militaries who, say, no, we'll use this responsibly. We don't need agreement. We don't need to prohibit systems. But all are in agreement generally that systems that function without anyone's oversight or control, are prohibited, and that no responsible military, or even less, an irresponsible military, is willing to, to accept that, because obviously they want systems that function under a chain of military command. However, again, we have a number of states which are sort of unsure of the extent to which they want to go in pushing for regulations. So that includes countries like Canada, which have said, we'll be responsible. We see the need to regulate systems, and the CCW is an appropriate forum. And I think what's surprising for engineers is to understand how much of a fight that has been to say that this one forum is an appropriate forum versus the appropriate forum, right? But that language shift matters, because if we just keep the discussion in that space, then those more oppositional states, which are the more powerful states, as perhaps expected, could really control anything that comes out. And so most likely then would be a watered down statement of some responsible rules of behavior. If we take it to another forum, and that 30 or so countries which really want to see systems prohibited, but are, less powerful states or smaller states like Austria, maybe we could see some regulation. And then again, I think you're pointing to this, when the rubber hits the road, how do you actually control what states use and how they deploy it? I think that will be the ultimate challenge. That it is the ultimate challenge for any international regulation, any treaties, is if you don't really have actual enforcement mechanisms, and even at times when you do have some enforcement mechanism, the question of who will actually enforce some of these norms and rules is the challenging one, because we don't have a global government, we don't have a world police. So if states don't follow certain rules, who's actually going to do anything about it? The reason this is all concerning in this particular moment, in this particular geopolitical moment, with so many shifts, is that we're still trying to use institutions that operated under the rules-based world order, right? That operated under a system and order which has been crumbling for some time, which has been sort of decaying and falling apart. So the question in 2026 is really important on these topics, because the CCW has to renew its mandate. So then we'll see what the states actually want to do here. Are they going to agree to anything? But also because of global events, we might see a push for the testing and deployment of technologies that are simply not ready. And where we could see, I think, some concerning developments. And then how do we walk back that use with regulation? That trying to regulate anything after it has been deployed is that much more challenging. But that has been what we've done for many generations. We've tried to sort of constrain things. And I think what's been particularly maybe disappointing for me to watch is that we had an opportunity here 10 years ago. When I said to people, I'm paying attention to these discussions on killer robots, right? We had an opportunity to really set some clear boundaries and rules, and they weren't utopian, they were not naive, they were simply about ensuring that if a system is developed, it follows existing international law, that we have accountability for these technologies. And that was an opportunity that we had and has not been capitalized on. And so now we're functioning in this rather, it's not all lawless, because existing international humanitarian law still applies, but I think a very, very loose framework that countries have, and they have very diverse perspectives depending on where they sit.
Fascinating. And perhaps related to this, you've written about the concept of trust as far as militaries and artificial intelligence are concerned. And you've argued that trust here is really important. The answer you've just given seems to suggest that that trust may be difficult, though, with modern weapons. So, could you talk a little bit about the importance of trust? Why you think it's important?
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think to say it's going to be difficult is an understatement. It's going to be incredibly challenging, but because it's challenging, it's important to do. And with anything in arms control, we say things like trust but verify. And so you have sort of ways in which you can verify whether states are following certain norms and rules. And as I outlined earlier, it's really difficult with these systems, because it could be, like a few lines of code that are different. It could be that you're doing things that are perhaps in that gray zone, perhaps, not fully problematic, but very concerning. And so the reason trust is important, actually, to me, over the years, what I've observed is that trust is important to everyone. Militaries want to have trustworthiness and trustworthy systems amongst the sort of the rank and file, because they want people to use the platforms and technologies. I believe it was the Australian Army that some years ago did a study just to sort of see whether, their sort of soldiers would actually use some of the systems. And they were quite shocked that, a lot of people were very concerned about using, autonomous systems, that they were concerned about whether some of these systems actually had been properly tested, whether so I think that's what we're talking about when we say, okay, you need some level of trust with sort of the soldiers and the technology. So militaries are interested in trust. Diplomats are interested in trust because they want to have sort of some agreement and the ability to engage in dialogue, to understand whether sort of the norms and rules that they're promoting will actually be followed. They want to exchange information and gain information. And then the public wants trust, right? They want to be able to trust that the military is doing things responsibly, and that, that humans aren't being targeted because there has been a misclassification in some system. And, there are some technical fixes to it, but a lot of it really is a political or, a social kind of discussion where we need to think about how do you build trust amongst these very adversarial actors at times. And that's why I sort of think that notion of trust and how we think about it with the use of these technologies is really critical. Because if we don't have the trust, we won't have systems being deployed or technologies being used. And I think some of the technology is really exciting and could actually improve things for militaries and then, primarily for my concern, civilians on the ground as well. So that that this is a civilian object and that it shouldn't be targeted, that it's a hospital, that, in war zones, obviously things aren't always black and white, and certain civilian objects are used or appropriated by different forces. But I would like to think that if there was, greater clarity at times, that we could avoid some of those sort of mistakes. I don't know how we fix, though, the problem of the lack of care. Some states simply do not care in certain contexts that this is a civilian object, the civilian infrastructure shouldn't be targeted if we're talking about cyber attacks, right? And that I don't know that we can solve fully, but I think if we work on the issue of trust, what even more adversarial states want to signal at times is that that they are being sort of responsible, and the reason they do that isn't because they're trying to be good actors on the international stage. The reason they do that is specifically to know that systems that are going to be used against them as well have been properly tested, or aren't going to act or misdirect their ships or cause problems for everyone. So that's sort of where I think we can do a lot of work in that, what are called confidence building measures, where we can exchange information and try and carve that common ground. One of the issues that we have in this international sort of space is that we have this belief that, when we have forums that function on this idea of sort of consensus or broad general agreement, that consensus means that you have veto power. But that's not what consensus means, right? Consensus is that we're all going to walk out of here maybe equally unhappy about some of the outcomes, but we can live with them. And I think that's sort of where we can contribute to that international conversation among states and build sort of the trust. The problem is, even within different militaries, there are very different perspectives. There are like very, very, clear, let's just deploy the technology and see how it works. And if it fails, it fails. Perspectives. And then there are, of course, more cautious perspectives. And the reason I like talking to militaries is because I like talking to them about sort of how do you address like conflict escalation, because you can try and field and test systems in non-problematic environments if they're not carrying payloads or weapons. But if you're testing it in a very contested areas such as the South China Sea or now different parts of the world, how do you avoid this sort of escalation that can happen, because you sort of hit maybe a military target of a state that really doesn't trust you, doesn't believe your story. So those are the kinds of conversations I think we have more often now about conflict escalation and saying, how do you sort of constrain that? But ultimately, I think this idea of trust building is in the interest of all of these various actors and the public as well. I think especially in a democracy, we want to be able to have transparency and oversight over the different platforms and the systems that our military is acquiring, and to know that there is a plan to responsibly develop that technology, to responsibly train the people who will be using it, to ensure like some of the maybe students in your class who are building some of these systems, that they are able to understand, why this particular piece of technology really needs to be thoroughly tested for various conditions, because there is a tendency in the military world to kind of try and use different tools and systems that they acquire for one purpose for another, right? And so you might have systems that were trained for like desert conditions being used, somewhere in the north, and you're like, this is not going to work well. So that, the technical experts are really important because they can communicate what are the limitations to some of the systems. There is a lot of hype. The tech companies really have an interest, in hyping up their technology and in saying that it's perfect and it'll work everywhere, it'll do everything. And of course, that's not the reality in most cases. So we have to, I think, precisely do what you're doing, which is build sort of these responsible individuals who will ask the right questions, who will ask, how is this technology going to be used? Like how are we evaluating its use? How are we testing it? How are we going to validate the results? And if you're using simulated data, is this data going to be actually representative of the conditions in which the systems are going to be deployed? So I think what's interesting is that a lot of the more advanced militaries and even small militaries, but have some advanced technologies, are very thoughtful about this. But I think pushing back against the hype and the pressure to develop and deploy the technologies is going to be challenging.
Yes, and I think this is a challenge that's faced outside of military environments too. Um, the question you're moving towards the question, I guess, of the relationship between technological change in the military and civilians. So you talk about the need for trust in there, but also there is the question of the use of technology as far as the support or the political impact with civilians is concerned, and the way that militaries might use technology in that context. So perhaps how they might use the weapons, but also how they might use technology for communications. So could you talk a little bit about the role of technology and the relationship between military activity and civilian populations?
Absolutely. I think what's been interesting to watch in Canada, for example, I remember we were a part of a conversation talking to the Canadian Department of National Defence about the need to like clearly communicate to the sort of the broader public if you are going to run some information influence campaign, just even if you're testing, right, the public to see how resilient your population is, because a lot of militaries are now and countries are concerned about the fact that, given our information environment, a lot of the public, it will believe certain things. So you don't have a very resilient population when it comes to propaganda. Communicating that you're doing these things, I think, is really important, even if it does mean that people will be aware that you're actually doing this. And they didn't do that, and they, I think, ran some story in Eastern Canada and talking about this idea of like, why do you need to communicate that you're doing this? Once it became clear that this was sort of a test by the Department of National Defense, there was a lot of backlash. And I think that's what's really important to understand in the sort of the role that the military plays in sort of our society, is the need to be really clear about how some of these technologies are used or misused, because there can be backlash even when maybe the technology isn't that bad. When maybe the concern is somewhat more minimal, but because you haven't communicated it does become sort of a broader and bigger issue for you to deal with. So the idea of being somewhat transparent about technology and its uses is a challenging one in the military space, in the defense space, in national security space, because at times the sort of there are adversarial states out there who are looking to see, like, what are you doing? How are you using these tools? How could we undermine those tools? So they have to balance how much information is released versus how much sort of information they try and protect. But I think there are ways to be a bit more transparent and clear with the public about the use of technology, and why maybe you want to say, okay, we're using this because it serves this purpose, and this is how it protects you, and this is how it protects our borders or protects our territory. In Canada, we're risk averse, but we're also very, when it comes to like national security or information sharing by government, we're also very, we tend to lean to sort of like black everything out because potentially it could have implications. And there's this real sort of hold on to, information, so much so that at times previously you could find out a lot more information about Canada from US government sources, like official websites and disclosures by the US government. And so this sort of disclosure information in Canada, public information, the interest of the public is a bit broken. Or, those people who file requests for freedom of information access will say that this is a fundamentally broken system. It takes sometimes years to get information, and some of the information by that time would have been released by other states or other sort of sources anyways. And so we have to really think about this because, again, the goal is to build a more resilient society. And a society that is more technically aware, that is better equipped to recognize misinformation. But if you're constantly sort of, keeping things secret and hiding, then of course that further erodes the trust that the public has into its government institutions. So, technology is sort of this tool, systems of tools that have to be thoughtfully communicated about. But that does not exist. Sometimes we think it exists, in sort of a separate space or a separate world from our political realities, and that's just not the case. And whenever we try and sort of say, well, it's just a technological tool, I don't think we fairly understand like the full impact and how it could be used or misused, and then what that means from a public perspective. So I would say we should err more on the side of like share a bit more information, even if at times it means that there will be greater insight how you're using different technologies, because eventually sort of the information will come out anyways often, and then it's very problematic for your country. We've seen this with the use of different algorithms for social spending schemes in places like the Netherlands, where, it became really clear that these were very discriminatory practices. And then there was a lot of backlash, a lot of problems in the country. So I think that's sort of the question for us is, how do we communicate responsibly about the technology, and how do we ensure that the technology is being responsibly used as well?
And presumably this is particularly important in the accountability of the security services and the activities that may be acceptable as far as they're concerned.
Absolutely. I think they, sometimes security services will say, like, you can't constrain us too much, or you can't limit us too much, because there are bad actors out there and there are bad guys out there, and which is all fair and true. But I think at times they sort of misunderstand what it means if there isn't any guardrails. And, I think we saw some of the worst practices and implications of this post 9/11, when sort of really anything went and anything was acceptable in trying to use tools, technologies for the purposes of national security and U.S. national security, which bled into other states as well. So many of the border practices that we have emerged post 9/11 were meant to be in place during this sort of extraordinary time, but have not decayed away. They've stayed in place and have become the norm. And I think that's what concerning with some of this is if there isn't a willingness to sort of regulate and put the guardrails in place, you will have those practices remain with you for a long time. And, and in many of these cases, what we saw in post 9/11 with the security practices with, extraordinary rendition and sort of all these things, people's lives were greatly impacted, and people who didn't really have at times, any reason for that to happen to them. And that's where I think it's a challenging conversation with them to have, because they sort of want to push back against efforts at control and regulation. And we absolutely, I think, if we care about how these technologies are used, have to keep pushing, because we have to say there have to be guardrails, there has to be clarity in what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Because if there is another set of extraordinary circumstances, I really worry that we will have some of these practices remain with us for a long time, that will impact a greater number of people.
Thank you. And on a more positive note, I know you've also taken an interest in the role of technology in countries that are emerging from conflict. And I was interested in how technology might support their recovery, but also, other things that it may do that would hinder that recovery.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the first instances of, how I saw conflicts transform because of these tools, it's very early, sort of like, it's almost 15 or so years ago in Northern Ireland, actually in Belfast, when I saw these youth organizing these fights between the different communities on Facebook, and they would meet up, and sometimes the older community members would be surprised by the level of organization, but it was just shared on Facebook, and that was sort of the way in which this conflict that had existed for so many decades had started to play out in this new technological space. And then, you see, though, the opportunity also for dialogue through some of these technologically mediated tools, through engagements, and sort of this shared sense of community that emerge in places like Northern Ireland in virtual spaces, right? Which is also interesting to understand and observe how you differentiate that from the actual physical spaces, which were still quite divided. And then in the Balkans as well, this concept of like this Balkan identity to sort of unite people from generally the regions of former Yugoslavia, but extending beyond former Yugoslavia in that part of the world, this sort of shared recognition of like cultural practices and things that are quite actually common across the different countries, despite their ethnic and at times linguistic differences. So I think what's been really interesting is to observe the way in which some of these transformations are happening. But I think you rightly point out, there's also the danger that exists with the promotion of exclusionary divisive dialogues, or positions, targeting of individuals within different communities, to be, very exclusionary to different communities in those countries as well. So it really is this sort of space, I think, in, early days of Arab Spring, what we saw was this idea that, I think the book, The Better Angels of Our Nature came out. There's all of this optimism, the social media was going to be this positive, powerful thing for, democratic change in various places. And of course, we've all seen how that has played out. So I think that's what we're sort of trying to understand now. Will these, or how best to ensure that the tools are used for more positive implications and impacts rather than sort of the more negative ones. But I think in a lot of places, it is becoming really challenging, because some of the countries that are more authoritarian, and quite a few countries are now authoritarian, one of the first things that they do when there is popular uprising or protests is they do internet shutdowns so that information cannot flow out more easily. And that's, I think, of course, an enormous challenge, because really the information is the power. So the ability to share information in real time from some of these places gives ordinary people a lot of power. And we saw, I think, this sort of way in which Ukraine was able to mobilize this really digitally connected, educated population in really, trying to defend its territory, sharing information about, where different Russian troop movements are. And so I think that's sort of the question now for the publics and civil society is how do we continue to harness that power and support the more positive power? And that's becoming increasingly challenging to do because in a lot of places there has been a lot of clampdown on civil society and civil society spaces, even the topics that I've been talking to you about, where people like myself could just, be able to attend really serious global security discussions. That ability to do that has been shrinking, and a lot of the more authoritarian governments have been limiting access to those discussions, and keeping them private or saying that they're only for member states or only for signatories. So sometimes not even observer countries are allowed in the room. So I think we're in a very interesting time when it comes to geopolitics, but also a very concerning one because we have all these trends that are sort of happening everywhere all at once, and it does feel like there is this need to push individuals to really start paying more attention in terms of how they could have sort of more positive influence. At least that's my hope. I know we want to be ending on a more positive note, but that sort of is generally where I think we have a great deal of opportunity to ensure that people really understand how effective they can be by using some of this technology and using some of these tools to sort of build a world that they'd like to see. Because a lot of what we are given and that's being portrayed is sort of the inevitable, right? The inevitability of autonomous weapon systems, the inevitability of these malicious cyber attacks on infrastructure. I think we still can ensure that that doesn't happen, but it is a very challenging time to be on
Yeah,
the side of being the constraining factor.
that leads nicely into my last question. I know that you're involved with Project Ploughshares, and I thought we might conclude with you just telling us a bit about that and what the role that it plays, and if there are perhaps opportunities for involvement by students.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ploughshares is one of Canada's oldest peace research institutes. Really started in the 1970s with a lot of focus on nuclear weapons, but also the conventional arms trade. And the observation then founder had on this sort of the level of military spending in some societies and sort of the lack of spending on development and education, and which he saw as ultimately very harmful to the future sort of trajectory of the states he was looking at. And what we've done is really try to ensure that we take in researchers and interns is to ensure that this sort of discussion on arms control and disarmament, that Canada actually has been so well known in the world for, like that it really continues and adapts to the new realities of warfare. So we still focus on nuclear weapons, we still focus on the conventional arms trade, and particularly looking at Canada's arms exports. But my colleague Jessica works on outer space security. I work on emerging military technologies like AI and autonomous weapons. And we try and really, sort of ensure that this Canadian voice that argues for more diplomatic solutions and political solutions does so from a position of you've done the research and you've done the work and you sort of are providing that level of advice. So we welcome student engagements. We had a very technical student help us with an AI tool to scrape information about arms exports. And, as your students will know, it's not as easy as people sometimes think it is to develop these tools. So those kinds of opportunities are things that I think would be great to have more engagement between sort of the more political world and the more technical world. I'm currently working on developing a project with the University of Ottawa with the research chair in AI technologies at the University of Ottawa, where we're trying to, and then with Minds Action Canada and Ploughshares, to really try and educate the students about the opportunities of engaging in the policy space and how to do so and how to provide solutions. Because oftentimes, and you will know this, all of you, there's a sort of separation of the technical people from the more policy oriented individuals. I mean, you really feel because so much of this requires technical understanding that there is this need for bridge building, and that's sort of been a key focus for us. Is in many ways I've seen my work, my role, and sort of being connected to University of Waterloo really as a translator between the different communities, trying to understand the technology, but also then understanding the global discussion, and then being able to sort of say why sometimes policymakers have these dreamy wishes for everything they want technology to do, like which is why technically can't do that yet, or maybe might not ever be able to do that. But this is why this is so important. We need more translators, more people who understand the policy discussions and who are willing to listen to and understand the technological discussions, and then vice versa, right? We need the technologists who will be able to explain and who will also understand what the political limitations are. Maybe this is not such a positive note to end on, but I often say to technical experts, the problem isn't that there aren't technical solutions at times. The problem isn't that there aren't legal solutions. The problem really is politics. And whether some technology is adapted or not, or whether it succeeds or not, largely depends on the political situation. And that's why I think understanding how important that political reality is so critical for people who have the technical skills, because politics ultimately shapes our societies.
Well, I think it seems to me that is a positive note to end on, in that it emphasizes the importance of people with technical capabilities, understanding the political impact of what they do, and seeking to build that bridge or be part of that bridge, as you've described. So to communicate that message, I think, is a very positive and important note to end on. I'm really grateful to you for talking to me, Branka. I found our discussion fascinating, and I think it will be very valuable for the people at the University of Waterloo. So
Yeah.
thanks again for doing it.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for having me.